Hello and welcome to my channel. Here I tell interesting stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Close your eyes for a moment. The moon was rising, and the world, for just a little while, belonged entirely to Artemis. Now settle in, because this is not going to be the kind of history you were taught in school, the kind that sits flat and gray on the page like pressed leaves in an old book. This is the story of one of the most extraordinary figures in all of human mythology, a goddess who was born on an island that barely existed, who helped deliver her own twin brother into the world before she was even a full day old, who swore an oath of eternal independence when she was just 3 years old and sitting on the knee of her father Zeus, and who for 3,000 years never once let anyone forget that she was something far more ancient, far more wild, and far more real than any simple story could contain. We begin, as all good stories must, at the very beginning. And the beginning of Artemis is, in itself, a story about survival. The world of ancient Greece was not, as many people imagine, a world of perfect white marble and calm philosophical gardens. The Greece that gave birth to Artemis was a world of earthquakes and sea storms, of mountains so steep that goats had to learn new ways to walk, of forests so dense that the trees themselves seemed to breathe. It was a world where the line between the human and the divine was not a wall, but a membrane, thin, trembling, easily crossed. Gods walked among mortals. Mortals became stars. Rivers had names and personalities. Every spring that bubbled up from the earth was a doorway to something older than memory. Into this world, a goddess was about to be born. But her birth, like everything about her, was going to be anything but simple. Her mother was Leto, a titaness of quiet grace and extraordinary dignity, the daughter of the titans Caius and Phoebe, who were themselves among the oldest divine beings in existence. Leto carried within her 2 children fathered by Zeus, the king of the Olympian gods, and this pregnancy had made her, quite literally, the most hunted creature in the world. Because Hera, Zeus's wife, the queen of all the gods, had learned of what had happened, and Hera's anger was a force of nature unto itself. Now here is where the historical record becomes fascinating, because when we speak of Hera's jealousy, we are not simply talking about the personal emotions of a divine character in a story. We are talking about something that ancient Greek scholars and modern historians alike have recognized as a deeply embedded cultural narrative: the eternal tension between order and wildness, between the tamed world of civilization and the untamed world of nature. Hera represented the domestic sphere, the sanctioned marriage, the ordered household. Leto represented something older and freer, a time before those structures existed, a power that did not need permission to exist. And so the enmity between them was not simply jealousy, it was a cosmological argument about the shape of the world. Hera, in her fury, issued a decree that no land beneath the sun, no solid earth anywhere in the world, should give shelter to Leto while she sought to give birth. Every island, every shore, every meadow and mountain that considered offering the laboring titaness a place to rest was visited by Hera's divine displeasure, and one by one they all turned Leto away. The great island of Kos refused. The shores of the mainland refused. Even the comfortable, well-established lands that might have offered shelter without much trouble found themselves suddenly unwilling, as if the ground itself had been warned. Leto wondered. This is one of the most poignant images in all of Greek mythology. This dignified, gentle titaness walking from shore to shore, growing heavier with each passing day, finding every door closed against her, every harbor unwilling to receive her. Ancient sources tell us that she traveled across the Aegean, moving from island to island, and everywhere she went the same answer awaited her. The labor pains were already beginning. There was nowhere to go. And then she found it. Or rather, it found her. A tiny island, barely more than a collection of rocks and a few sparse trees rising from the blue-gray Aegean Sea. An island so small and so unstable that it technically floated, untethered to the seafloor, drifting with the currents. Because it was not fixed to the earth, some ancient sources argued that Hera's decree did not technically apply to it. It was not, in the strictest sense, land the way that Hera had forbidden. This island was called Asteria, named after its own divine origin, and later it would be known as Delos, the brilliant one, the revealed, and it would become one of the most sacred places in the entire ancient world. Delos accepted Leto. The rocks of that tiny floating island, which had no reason to be brave and every reason to be afraid, opened themselves to this wandering mother and said, in whatever language rocks and islands use when they speak, "Yes, you may rest here. You may bring your children into the world here." And in exchange for this act of extraordinary courage, Delos was promised that it would become the most famous and most celebrated island in the Aegean, that a temple would be built there that would draw pilgrims from across the entire known world. And so it happened. The archaeological record confirms it. The sanctuary of Apollo and Artemis on Delos became one of the great religious centers of ancient Greece, drawing worshippers from as far away as Egypt and the Black Sea coast, and the island that had once been so small and forgotten that it barely had a name became a place so holy that it was eventually declared illegal to be born or to die on its soil. All births and all deaths had to be carried to a neighboring island, because Delos itself was too sacred to be touched by ordinary human mortality. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because on the day of the divine birth, none of that had happened yet. On that day, there was only a small rocky island, a laboring mother, and a birth that was about to change the mythology of the entire Mediterranean world. The labor was not quick. Ancient sources, particularly Callimachus, in his magnificent hymn to Delos, describe a labor of 9 days and 9 nights, a number that carries enormous symbolic weight in ancient Greek culture, representing a complete cycle of difficulty, a full passage through trial. For 9 days, the goddesses of Olympus gathered in attendance, all of them except one. All the birth goddesses, all the divine midwives, all those who were associated with the sacred passage of new life into the world. They all came. All except Eileithyia, the goddess of childbirth itself, who had been prevented from coming by Hera, kept on Olympus by gifts and distractions, unaware of what was happening on the little floating island far below. Finally, after 9 days, the other goddesses sent Iris, the rainbow goddess, the divine messenger, to bring Eileithyia secretly to Delos, offering her a great golden necklace as persuasion. Eileithyia came, and when she set foot on Delos and Leto could finally feel the divine presence of the birth goddess, the labor could at last reach its completion. The first child born was a daughter. She arrived in the world with silver light around her. The ancient texts suggest quiet, purposeful, already somehow entirely herself. This was Artemis. And what happened next, in the mythology, is one of those details that stops you completely if you let yourself think about it properly, because it is so strange and so perfect and so completely in keeping with everything that Artemis would ever be. The infant goddess, newly born, having just completed the most difficult journey any living creature ever makes. The journey from non-existence into existence did not rest. She did not cry. She did not close her eyes and sleep the way newborns sleep, exhausted and soft and new. Instead, the mythology tells us that she immediately turned and helped her mother through the remaining hours of labor that followed, assisting in the birth of her twin brother Apollo, who arrived shortly after. Think about this for a moment, because it deserves your full attention, even as your own eyes grow heavy. The very first act of Artemis in the world was an act of care for her mother. Her very first hour of existence was spent in service, in midwifery, in the sacred work of bringing new life through safely. Before she had drawn a single arrow, before she had run through a single forest, before she had sworn any oath or established any sanctuary, Artemis stood beside her mother and helped. This detail, which appears in various forms across multiple ancient sources, is not accidental. The Greeks were not careless myth-makers. Everything in their divine stories meant something, carried symbolic weight, pointed toward a deeper truth about the nature of the figure being described. And the truth embedded in this first moment of Artemis's existence is this: she was, from the very first breath she drew, a guardian, a protector, someone who stood between the vulnerable and the darkness. Delos, that brave little island, was anchored to the seafloor after the birth, fixed at last to the solid earth, rewarded for its courage with permanence. The mythology says that 4 great golden pillars rose from the seafloor and locked it in place, and from that day forward it drifted no more. The sanctuary grew over the centuries, and if you were to visit the archaeological site of Delos today, and I encourage you to imagine this as you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine it as a place you are floating gently toward. You would find the ruins of temples and treasuries, and lion statues carved in white marble, standing in a row along the sacred lake that was supposed to have been the exact spot where Leto rested during the birth. The lions, carved in the 7th century before the Common Era, still crouch along the shore of the dried lake bed, their mouths slightly open, their stone eyes directed upward toward the sky, as if they are still watching for the moment when a goddess first opened her eyes and looked at the world she had just arrived in. Artemis grew quickly, as gods do, not in years but in essence, becoming herself with a speed and completeness that mortals spend entire lifetimes trying to achieve. And it was when she was still very young, the mythology places her at 3 years old, though divine age is always more metaphor than mathematics, that she asked her father for something that would define the entire rest of her existence. Zeus, king of the gods, father of Artemis, was sitting, the way kings sit, with that particular quality of largeness that powerful people sometimes have, as if they take up more space in the air than ordinary beings, and his small daughter climbed into his lap. This detail is from Callimachus again, who in his 3rd century BCE hymn to Artemis gives us the most detailed and most charming account of this moment, a moment that is part divine petition and part the completely ordinary experience of a child asking a parent for something very important. Zeus looked down at this daughter who had been born in such difficulty, who had already shown herself to be someone extraordinary, and he asked her what gifts she wished him to grant her. Artemis, this 3-year-old goddess with silver light around her, gave him a list. She spoke quietly, purposefully, with complete certainty about what she wanted. And what she wanted was, taken together, a complete manifesto of independence. She asked for eternal virginity. She asked for many names so that she could never be reduced to a single definition. She asked for a bow and arrows, silver ones, made by the Cyclopes. She asked for a short tunic that would not hinder her running. She asked for 60 daughters of the ocean to be her companions, all 9 years old, all free. She asked for 20 nymphs of the forests and rivers to take care of her hunting hounds when she was not hunting. She asked for all the mountains of the world, and she asked that she be given any city she chose. Though only one, she said she did not need many cities because she planned to spend most of her time in the mountains anyway. And then she made the request that was, perhaps, the most revolutionary of all. She asked that she never be required to do the work that Eileithyia did, the work of attending to births. It is important to understand the careful historical irony embedded in this request. Artemis, who had spent her very first hours helping her mother through a difficult labor, who had in some sense been a birth attendant before she was even an hour old, this same goddess asked to be excused from that role going forward, not because she disdained it, but because she had already done it. She had already fulfilled that role, already given everything that could be given in that first sacred act of care. Now she was asking to be allowed to be something else, something wilder, something that belonged to the mountains and the forests and the night sky rather than to the ordered world of houses and hearths and human need. Zeus granted everything. He granted it laughing, the myth tells us, the kind of deep, pleased laughter of a father who recognizes in his child something that surprises and delights him, something that exceeds what he expected. He told her she would have more than 30 cities, not just the one she had asked for. He made her mistress of harbors and roadways, protector of children, guardian of the sacred moment when young girls become women and make the crossing from one life to another. He gave her everything she asked for and more. And in doing so, he established Artemis not merely as one goddess among many, but as a force that touched almost every aspect of human life: wild nature and safe harbors, children and childbirth, the moon and the hunt, life and death, and the threshold between them. Artemis took her silver bow and she walked out of Olympus into the wide world, and the forests received her, and the mountains opened their paths for her, and the night sky curved above her like a second bow drawn taut, ready. She was 3 years old, and she had already understood something that most beings spend forever trying to learn: that freedom is not the absence of responsibility, but the courage to choose which responsibilities are truly yours. Let that thought settle around you now like the darkness settles, gently, without weight. Let the image of that small silver figure walking into the ancient forests be the last thing that moves in your mind before the next chapter begins. The next chapter, where Artemis will prove, in the mountains of Arcadia and the sacred groves of countless sanctuaries, exactly what she meant by freedom and exactly what she was prepared to do to protect it. The owl in the dark is still calling. The forest is still listening. And the huntress, somewhere in the silver distance of 3,000 years of story, is pulling back her bow and breathing out slowly, the way you are breathing now, slowly, evenly, releasing the weight of the day one careful breath at a time. When we left Artemis at the end of our first chapter, she was 3 years old in the mythological sense, newly granted everything she had asked for by a laughing and somewhat astonished Zeus, and she was walking away from Olympus into the ancient world with a silver bow across her back and the whole of the untamed earth before her. But before she could hunt a single creature, before she could run a single mountain path, before the great adventures that would define her mythology for 3,000 years could begin, she had work to do. She needed her bow. Not the bow that Zeus had promised her, not the abstract idea of a silver bow granted in a divine decree on a golden Olympian morning. She needed the actual physical object, the weight of it in her hands, the tension of the string against her fingers, the particular song it would make when she drew it back and released. Because Artemis was never a goddess of abstractions. She was a goddess of the concrete, the immediate, the real. And the most real thing in her world was always going to be the feeling of a bowstring released perfectly, the arrow already gone before you heard the sound, your breath still held in that fraction of a second between intention and result. To get her bow, she went to the forge of the Cyclopes. Now here is where I want you to slow down with me for a moment, because this particular journey, a small goddess traveling alone to find the most fearsome craftsman in the cosmos, is one of the most vivid and most human scenes in all of ancient mythology, and it comes to us in magnificent detail from Callimachus, our 3rd century BCE Alexandrian poet and librarian, who had access to sources we have long since lost, and who wrote about Artemis with a combination of scholarly precision and genuine devotion that is, frankly, rare in any era of writing. His hymn to Artemis is one of the great documents of the ancient world, and the scene he describes of the young goddess visiting the forge is so detailed, so warm, so full of the particular texture of lived experience that reading it across 2,000 years feels less like reading history and more like receiving a letter from someone who was actually there. The Cyclopes, those enormous, one-eyed divine smiths, children of heaven and earth, the makers of Zeus's thunderbolts, were at work when Artemis arrived. They were on the island of Lipari, in the volcanic Aeolian archipelago north of Sicily, where the ancient Greeks believed the great divine forge was located, its fires fed by the volcanic heat that still today makes those islands smell of sulfur and deep earth. If you have ever stood near a volcanic vent and felt the ground warm beneath your feet, and smelled that particular mineral sharpness in the air, you have stood in the anteroom of the Cyclops' workshop, and you would understand why the ancient Greeks placed their divine forge there, because it already felt like somewhere gods worked. Callimachus tells us that when the young Artemis arrived and knocked, or appeared, or simply walked in, as gods sometimes do, the Cyclopes were in the middle of forging something enormous for Poseidon. The great workshop was full of fire and noise and the particular controlled chaos of masters at work. Iron rang against iron. The bellows breathed great gusts of superheated air. Sparks rose and fell like brief constellations. And into all of this walked a small silver girl, who was, technically, barely older than a thought. The leader of the Cyclopes, Brontes, whose name means thunder, reached out and lifted her onto his knee. This is another of those small details that stops you completely, because it mirrors almost exactly the scene on Olympus where Artemis sat on Zeus's knee and made her requests. But where Zeus was her father, and the scene carried the weight of paternal authority, here the dynamic was different and, in its way, more revealing. Brontes was not her father. He was one of the most terrifying beings in the cosmos, enormous, fire-scarred, one-eyed, capable of forging weapons that could shake the foundations of the world. And he set this small goddess on his knee with the gentle matter-of-factness of someone who has just met a child and decided, without deliberation, that she belongs there. Artemis did not flinch. She never flinched. She sat on the knee of thunder and told him what she needed. What followed, according to Callimachus, was not a simple transaction. The Cyclopes did not simply hand over a pre-made silver bow and send her on her way. They made it for her, made it specifically for her, to her specifications, tuned to her particular strength and her particular style of movement, designed to fit perfectly in her specific hand. This matters enormously, both mythologically and historically, because it tells us something crucial about the relationship between a tool and its user in the ancient Greek worldview. A weapon was not interchangeable. A bow was not simply a bow. It was a relationship between the object and the person who wielded it, a conversation between craft and purpose, and getting that relationship exactly right was itself a sacred act. The Cyclopes understood this. They always had. It was why their work was divine rather than merely excellent. While the bow was being made, the mythology gives us a brief but extraordinary window into the young goddess's character. She went to find her hunting hounds, and the account of how she acquired them, traveling to the wilds of Arcadia, the rugged central highlands of the Peloponnese, to find the divine huntsman Pan, god of the wild places, is itself a small masterpiece of mythological storytelling. Pan, when Artemis found him, was surrounded by his dogs, those extraordinary animals that ancient sources describe with the kind of loving detail that only someone who has truly known great dogs would think to include. Callimachus lists them by breed and number. 7 swift hounds of Sparta, 3 of the golden-eared kind, 2 dogs spotted like pards, 1 particularly extraordinary hunting bitch. Pan gave them all to her. He was, by all mythological accounts, in a generous mood that day, and it is worth noting that this is consistent with what we know of Pan's characterization across multiple ancient sources. He was capricious, wild, unpredictable, but not unkind. And to Artemis, who was herself a creature of the wild places, he seems to have felt an immediate kinship. Artemis took the hounds, and she took them to run. She took them up into the mountains of Arcadia, those limestone highlands where the forest grew so thick that even today, standing in the mountain passes of the central Peloponnese, you can feel the weight of ancient silence pressing against you from all sides, can feel why the Greeks believed that this particular landscape was so saturated with divinity that Pan himself lived in its caves and satyrs danced in its clearings at midnight. Now I want to pause here and do something that the best historians always do, which is to anchor the mythology in the physical world, because Arcadia was a real place and it was genuinely extraordinary. Archaeological evidence confirms that the mountain communities of ancient Arcadia maintained some of the oldest religious practices in the Greek world, older than the Olympian religion, older than the great pan-Hellenic sanctuaries at Olympia and Delphi. The cult of Artemis in Arcadia was particularly ancient and particularly fierce. At the sanctuary of Artemis Hymnia near Orchomenos, excavations have revealed votives dating back to the early Iron Age, small bronze figurines of deer and hunting hounds, tiny silver arrows, ceramic fragments painted with running female figures. These are the material traces of thousands of ordinary people bringing their devotion to a mountain goddess, leaving behind these small, bright objects as a way of saying, I was here. I believed. She was real to me. And this is the thing about Artemis that historians find most compelling and most difficult to fully explain: the sheer longevity and geographical breadth of her worship. She was worshipped across the entire Greek-speaking world, from the frozen shores of the Black Sea to the hot coastal plains of Asia Minor, from the mountains of Arcadia to the island of Crete, from Sicily to Egypt. And in every place she was worshipped, she was slightly different. Her name, her attributes, her sacred animals, her rituals all shifted and adapted to fit the landscape and the needs of the people who called on her. In Arcadia, she was a mountain huntress. On the Aegean coast, she was a goddess of harbors and sailors. In the Eastern Greek world, at Ephesus, she would become something even more ancient and more powerful. But that, as they say, is a story for another chapter. What was constant across all of these variations, across all these different landscapes and cultures and centuries, was this: she was always wild. She was always independent. And she was always, always precisely herself. The silver bow, when it was finally placed in her hands, was exactly right. Every ancient source that describes it agrees on this. It was silver, it was perfect, and it fit her hand as if it had been born there rather than forged, which in a sense it had been. Because the bow that the Cyclops made for Artemis was not just a weapon. It was an extension of her will, a physical manifestation of her intention, her precision, her refusal to miss. When Artemis drew her bow, she was not hoping, she was not trying, she was simply choosing with absolute certainty where the arrow would go. And it went there, always. There is a wonderful passage in the Iliad, that great, terrible, magnificent poem that Homer gave to the world sometime in the 8th century BCE, and that the Greeks considered not just literature, but something close to sacred history, where Artemis appears briefly, and the passage is so perfectly characteristic of her that it deserves to be held up to the light for a moment. She appears during a battle between the gods themselves, a scene of cosmic chaos and divine violence that stretches across several books of the poem. And in the middle of all this divine warfare, when Artemis is struck by Hera, her own stepmother, who hits her across the ears with her own silver quiver in a moment of undisguised spite, Artemis does something that Homer describes in a single brief phrase that has resonated down 2,500 years of scholarship. She runs, not in fear, not in defeat. She runs to Zeus, her father, and she climbs into his lap and weeps, and Zeus holds her, and she tells him what happened. And then she simply returns to her forests and her mountains and gets on with her eternal work, as if the entire incident with Hera was something she had already decided not to remember. What Homer gives us in that small scene is something psychologically acute and historically significant, a portrait of a goddess who is entirely capable of being hurt, who feels pain and humiliation and turns to her parent for comfort, but who does not allow any of that to define her or to slow her down. She grieves briefly, and then she moves on, back to the wilderness that is her real home, back to the work that is her real nature. There is, if you are looking for it, something deeply modern about this portrait, the combination of vulnerability and resilience, the willingness to feel without being consumed by feeling. The ancient Greeks were, in this as in many things, far more psychologically sophisticated than they are sometimes given credit for. But let us return to the moment when Artemis first held her bow, that young silver figure standing in the volcanic shadows of the Cyclops forge, the perfect silver bow finally in her hands, the divine hounds already ranging across the highlands of Arcadia, somewhere ahead of her, the whole unmapped wilderness of the ancient world spread open before her like a gift. This was the moment, not her birth, not the granting of her wishes by Zeus, but this specific moment when the physical reality of her purpose settled into her hands, that Artemis became fully herself. This was the moment when the idea became the fact. She lifted the bow. She drew the string back, felt the resistance of it, the living tension of divine silver under pressure, the particular quality of held breath that every archer knows, and that every archer in every century from the Paleolithic to the present, has found to be one of the most intensely concentrated experiences available to a human or divine body. Everything narrows to a point. Everything else falls away. There is only the line between you and the thing you are aiming at, and the decision, already made, to release. She released. The first arrow of Artemis crossed the ancient world like a line of silver light, and the forests heard it, and the mountains heard it, and the night sky curved above everything like a great dark bow of its own, heard it and answered. Now, here is where the mythology of Artemis begins to acquire its greatest complexity, because once she had her bow, the question of what she used it for, and more importantly, what she refused to use it for, reveals something profound about the ancient Greek conception of the divine order of the natural world. Artemis was a goddess of the hunt, yes, but she was equally, and perhaps more fundamentally, a goddess of the protection of wild things. She was the mistress of animals, Potnia Theron, a title so ancient that it predates the Olympian religion entirely, appearing in Minoan and Mycenaean art long before the classical Greek period, depicted on Bronze Age seals as a female figure flanked by lions or deer, arms outstretched, animals pressed against her on both sides. This image, the divine feminine figure holding the wild world in balance from the center, is one of the oldest religious images in the entire Mediterranean basin. Artemis inherited it and made it her own, but she did not invent it. She was the latest embodiment of something that human beings had been reaching toward since they first tried to make sense of the relationship between themselves and the natural world. The paradox at the heart of her mythology, the huntress who protects what she hunts, the goddess of the kill, who is also the guardian of young animals and nursing mothers, is not actually a paradox if you understand it through the lens of ancient Greek ecological thinking, which was, in its own way, remarkably sophisticated. Ancient Greek hunters and the religious practices surrounding the hunt operated under a system of what modern anthropologists call reciprocal ethics, a set of rules and rituals governing when you could kill, what you could kill, how much you could take, and what you owed back to the world in exchange for what you took. You could not hunt pregnant animals. You could not hunt nursing mothers. You could not kill more than you needed. You had to make the appropriate offerings before the hunt and give proper thanks after it. You had to acknowledge that what you were taking had value beyond its usefulness to you. Artemis was the divine enforcer of these rules. She was not simply the goddess of hunting. She was the goddess of the right relationship between the hunter and the hunted, between human need and natural balance. And when those rules were violated, when a hunter killed more than was needed, or killed something sacred, or hunted in a sacred grove without permission, the punishment from Artemis was swift, and it was absolute. The most famous example of this, and one we will return to in greater detail in a later chapter, is the story of Actaeon, the hunter who violated the sacred boundary between the human world and Artemis's private, untouchable wilderness. But there were others. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae and leader of the Greek forces at Troy, was becalmed at the port of Aulis because one of his men had killed a sacred deer in Artemis's grove. The winds refused to blow. The entire Greek fleet sat motionless in the harbor, unable to sail for Troy, for months. The price Artemis demanded for this violation was not small, and the story of what happened at Aulis is one of the great moral horror stories of ancient myth. a story that the playwright Euripides would later dramatize in Iphigenia at Aulis with an unflinching honesty that left ancient audiences devastated, and that still, if you read it in the right state of mind, retains the power to make your blood run cold. But I am running ahead of the story again, and the night is long, and the pillow is soft, and there is no need to rush. Let us stay, for now, in the earlier, quieter chapter of Artemis's life, before the great conflicts, before the punishments and the tragedies. In that golden silver time, when she first ran through the forests of Arcadia with her hounds and her nymphs, learning the landscape of her own divinity. The nymphs who accompanied Artemis were not, in the ancient understanding, simply supernatural servants. They were not decorative attendants in flowing robes who stood behind her in paintings and mosaics looking beautiful and purposeless. They were divine beings in their own right, nature spirits bound to specific places, specific rivers, specific trees, specific mountains. Each one was herself, fully and completely, with her own history and her own character, and her own relationship to the particular piece of world she inhabited. When Artemis gathered them to her company, she was not assembling a retinue. She was forming an alliance, a network of divine feminine presences distributed across the entire landscape of the natural world, each one anchored to her own place, all of them connected through their shared oath of independence and their shared service to the goddess who had chosen freedom at the age of 3 and never once regretted it. This is confirmed in the material record by the extraordinary distribution of Artemis shrines and sanctuaries across the Greek world. Unlike many Greek sanctuaries, which were urban monuments at the center of city life, a large proportion of Artemis's sacred sites were deliberately located outside cities, at the edges of cultivated land, at the boundaries between the tamed and the wild, in mountain passes and river crossings and coastal headlands. Archaeologically, these threshold locations are significant. They represent a conscious mapping of divine presence onto the liminal zones of human experience, the places where one thing ends and another begins, where the known world shades into the unknown, where the familiar safety of civilization gives way to the wild and unpredictable forces of nature. Artemis was the guardian of those boundaries. She stood at every threshold facing outward, watching the dark. And what did she see watching the dark? What did that perpetual vigilance at the edge of things reveal to her that the gods who stayed safely in their golden halls could not know? This, perhaps, is the deepest secret of Artemis, and one that her mythology circles around without ever quite stating directly. She saw that the wild world was not the enemy. It was not the chaos that civilization needed to conquer and control. It was instead the source, the original reality from which all human meaning ultimately derived, the root system of existence, the dark earth in which every flower of human culture was ultimately planted. Without the forest, there was no wood for the fire. Without the wild deer, there was no food for the village. Without the rain falling on the mountain, there was no water in the spring. Without death, there was no life. And without Artemis standing at the threshold, bow drawn, watching, none of the traffic between those worlds could happen safely. She was not, in other words, simply a goddess of the outdoors, a divine version of a nature enthusiast who happened to enjoy archery. She was the living principle of the necessary relationship between human civilization and the natural world that sustained it. She was the conscience of the hunt, the guardian of balance, the silver arrow that always found its mark, not despite its precision, but because of it. Let that settle into you now, the way certainty settles, not with noise but with weight, the comfortable, grounding weight of something that has always been true finally being recognized. The huntress who protects what she hunts, the guardian who stands at the boundary between safety and wildness, the goddess who was 3 years old when she understood that the most important thing a being could do was choose with absolute clarity what she was for. Outside your window right now, somewhere in the dark, the world that Artemis has always guarded is going about its ancient business. An owl is hunting. A deer is moving through shadows. A river is carrying mountain water down toward the sea. The balance that she enforced for 3,000 years of active worship, and that the ecological principles underlying her mythology have enforced for far longer than that, is still holding imperfectly and beautifully the way all real things hold, with effort, with attention, with a kind of constant care that never announces itself and never rests. Breathe in, breathe out. The silver bow is drawn back somewhere in the dark above you, and the arrow that it holds is not an ending. It is a beginning. The beginning of the next chapter, where Artemis will meet the people who tested her boundaries and learned, each in their own way, and at considerable personal cost, exactly what it meant to cross the line into sacred territory without permission. But first, and this is important, we need to understand something about the nature of divine punishment in ancient Greek mythology. Because if we approach these stories with modern assumptions about justice and mercy, we will miss everything that makes them extraordinary. The Greeks did not believe in a universe governed by infinite forgiveness. They believed in a universe governed by balance, by what they called dike, which we translate inadequately as justice, but which meant something closer to the natural order of things, the proper proportion between actions and their consequences, the cosmic equilibrium that made the world function. When that equilibrium was disturbed, when someone took more than their share, overstepped their proper limits, violated the sacred boundaries that held the world together, the universe corrected itself, not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but out of the same impersonal necessity that causes a pendulum to swing back after it has been pushed too far in one direction. Artemis was one of the instruments of that correction. She was, in this sense, less a person making choices and more a force of nature expressing itself, like the cold snap that kills the overextended vine, like the flood that reclaims the floodplain that humans forgot belonged to the river. To be struck by Artemis was not to be persecuted. It was to experience the consequence of having forgotten something essential about the world you inhabited. Hold that thought. Now let us meet Actaeon. Actaeon was a hunter, not a bad man by all ancient accounts, not cruel, not arrogant in the obvious ways, not someone who had committed 100 smaller violations before the famous final one. He was simply a hunter of extraordinary skill, trained by the centaur Chiron, that remarkable half-man, half-horse teacher who educated half the heroes of Greek mythology with a combination of practical woodcraft and genuine philosophical wisdom. Actaeon knew the forests of Boeotia the way you know a language you have spoken since birth, instinctively, completely, in your bones. He was, by every measure that his world used to evaluate a hunter, excellent. And then one afternoon, in the mountains of Cithaeron, on a day that had begun like any other hunting day, with the morning mist still curling off the streams, and his hounds ranging ahead of him through the undergrowth, Actaeon came around a corner of rock and found himself looking at something he was never supposed to see. Artemis was bathing. The scene that the ancient sources describe, and here Ovid, writing in his Metamorphoses in the 1st century BCE, gives us the most detailed and most visually extraordinary account, though earlier versions appear in numerous Greek sources, is one of extraordinary and terrible beauty. A hidden grotto so secret that even the nymphs who served Artemis believed it unknown to any mortal eye. A pool of water so clear and cold it seemed made of compressed moonlight. The goddess herself in the water, her silver bow and quiver hanging on the branches of a nearby pine, her hunting hounds resting on the bank. Around her, her nymphs attended her with the ease of intimacy, pouring water, holding garlands, moving through the steam of the cool water in the warm afternoon air, with the unhurried grace of beings who exist entirely outside the ordinary pressures of time. And then the snap of a branch, a shadow falling across the pool, and Actaeon standing there at the entrance to the grotto, staring. Ovid is careful to tell us, and this is one of the things that makes the story so morally complex and so enduringly interesting to scholars and readers alike, that Actaeon did not seek this out. He was not a voyeur, not someone who had been searching for Artemis's secret places with prurient intent. He stumbled. He took a wrong turn in the forest, followed the sound of water on a hot day, came through a gap in the rocks that he had never seen before, and found himself looking at the one sight in the entire cosmos that he was absolutely, categorically forbidden to see. He was guilty of nothing more deliberate than being in the wrong place at the wrong moment. It did not matter. It did. This is the part of the story that makes modern readers most uncomfortable, and rightly so, because it raises a question that the ancient Greeks were themselves genuinely divided about. The question of whether punishment without deliberate guilt is just. Euripides, writing in the 5th century BCE, returned again and again to exactly this question in his tragedies. What do we owe to a justice system that does not distinguish between intentional transgression and accidental violation? Can a universe governed by balance rather than intention be called good? But let us return to the grotto before we lose ourselves in philosophy, because what happens next is both brutally abrupt and mythologically perfect. Artemis, according to Ovid, had no weapon within reach. Her bow was on the pine branch, her arrows were in the quiver with it, and there was no time and no need for any of that. She reached down and scooped water from the sacred pool and threw it at Actaeon, and where the water touched him, he changed. The transformation of Actaeon into a stag is one of the most famous metamorphoses in all of classical mythology, and Ovid describes it with a clinical precision that is almost more disturbing than outright violence would be. The neck lengthening, the ears growing pointed, the hands becoming hooves. And here Ovid lingers, because in the moment when Actaeon looks down and sees hooves where hands were, he understands what has happened to him. And the understanding is the cruelest part of it. He still has his mind. He still thinks as Actaeon. He still knows exactly who he is, what he has lost, why it has happened. He simply can no longer say any of it, because the only sound he can make is the sound of a stag. His own hounds found him, those extraordinary hunting animals that he had trained himself, that knew his voice and his scent and his footstep. They found this stag in the forest, and they did what they were trained to do. They pursued. Actaeon ran, which is what stags do, and he ran with the speed and the terror of a wild animal, because he was now, bodily and completely, a wild animal, even though inside he was still screaming his own name. He fell eventually in a clearing. His hounds brought him down, and Actaeon, the hunter, died the death of the hunted. Ancient scholars puzzled over this story for centuries. Was it just? Was it mercy in some terrible cosmic sense? A death that was at least quick, at least complete, better than the alternative of living forever as a man in an animal's body? Was it a statement about the absolute inviolability of sacred space, that some things are simply not for human eyes, regardless of intent, and that the appropriate response to having accidentally seen them is not to look away and pretend it did not happen, but to be fundamentally, permanently changed by the encounter? The stories do not agree with each other about the details. In some versions, Aegean had boasted earlier that he was a better hunter than Artemis, an act of hubris that the Greeks would have recognized immediately as the kind of thing the universe corrects. In other versions, he is as innocent as Ovid suggests. The myth carries both readings simultaneously, and both are true, because myths are not legal documents. They are not interested in establishing a single fixed meaning. They are interested in holding a set of questions open, permanently, uncomfortably, productively open. What is not ambiguous is the outcome. Aegean crossed a sacred threshold. Accidentally or deliberately, it made no difference, and the world changed in response. The hunter became the hunted. The observer became the observed. The boundary between the human world and the divine feminine wilderness held absolutely, regardless of the cost. Now, while Aegean's story is perhaps the most famous of Artemis's punishments, it is not the one that tells us most about her character. For that, we need to look at the story of Orion. Orion's story is, in some ways, the inverse of Aegean's, because Orion did not stumble into Artemis's sacred space uninvited. Orion was invited in. He was, in fact, the one figure in all of Artemis's mythology who came closest to being her companion in the fullest sense, her equal, her friend, the one being in the cosmos who could keep pace with her across the mountains and the sea and the edge of the night sky. And his story is, because of this, the most poignant and the most human of all the stories attached to Artemis. It is the one that suggests that even the most determinedly independent of beings can feel the particular weight of genuine companionship and the particular devastation of losing it. The sources for Orion's story are multiple and contradictory in their details, which is itself significant. It means the story was told widely and passionately in many different communities across the Greek world, each of which had its own version, its own emphasis, its own understanding of what the central truth of the story was. But the core elements remain consistent across almost all versions. Orion was a giant hunter, son of Poseidon, of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary skill. He was, in the mythological landscape, Artemis's counterpart, the masculine principle of the hunt to her feminine principle, the night hunter to her moon, the one figure in all of Greek mythology who did not approach her with fear or desire for conquest, but simply, recognizably, as another creature who belonged to the same wild world she did. They hunted together. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact in Artemis's entire mythology, that she who had sworn eternal independence and eternal chastity, who had refused the company of men as a matter of divine principle since she was 3 years old, chose to hunt alongside Orion through the long nights of the ancient world. Ancient sources differ on the nature of their relationship. Some suggest it was purely the companionship of equals. Some suggest something warmer and more complicated. And the goddess of love, Aphrodite, who appears in several versions of the story as a troublemaking presence, clearly thought there was something worth interfering with. What is certain is that it ended. The exact cause varies by source. In some versions, Orion is killed by a giant scorpion sent by Gaia, or by the jealous god Apollo, who was uncomfortable with his sister's attachment to a mortal companion. In one of the most haunting versions, it is Artemis herself who kills him, tricked by Apollo into shooting at what she believes is a distant target in the sea, only to discover when she swims out to retrieve it that she has killed the one being in the world who had been, in some undeniable sense, her friend. This version, the one in which Artemis kills Orion by accident, manipulated by her own brother's jealousy, is almost unbearable to read for the grief that it contains. Because in this version, Artemis is not the punisher. She is the one who is punished. She is the one who experiences, in one shattering moment, the full cost of allowing someone into the wild, private world she had always kept perfectly sealed against intrusion. She had made an exception, opened a door just wide enough for one particular person to enter, and the universe, in the form of her own perfect aim and her own terrible accuracy, had closed that door forever. She placed him in the sky. This is one of those mythological gestures that carries enormous emotional weight precisely because it is so inadequate as a solution and so completely human as an impulse. The desire to preserve what you have lost, to keep it visible, to turn grief into something you can see and navigate by. Orion became one of the great constellations of the winter sky, that enormous star figure with his belt and his sword and his hunting dogs beside him. Sirius, the dog star, the brightest star in the night sky, is mythologically one of Orion's hunting hounds, following him still across the dark. And somewhere in the ancient imagination, Artemis, silver, solitary, armed, runs through the forest below, and the sky above her carries the shape of the one loss she never entirely recovered from. Ancient astronomers noted that the constellation of Artemis, the moon, never rises at the same time as Orion. They are perpetually separated by the mechanics of the sky, always just out of sight of each other, always just around the curve of the horizon from the reunion that will never happen. Whether this astronomical fact preceded the myth or the myth was built to explain the fact is a question that scholars have debated without resolution for centuries. What matters is that the ancient Greeks looked up at the night sky and saw in its patterns not just navigation, but narrative. Not just light, but loss. Not just stars, but the specific grief of a specific goddess who had once made an exception to her rules and paid for it in the most absolute currency available. Not all of Artemis's encounters with those who tested her ended in tragedy. Some ended in transformation of a very different kind. Not punishment, but protection. Not loss, but rescue. And it is in these stories that we see another dimension of the goddess entirely, one that complicates the portrait of the fierce, unforgiving huntress and reveals something older and more complex underneath. Consider Callisto. Callisto was one of Artemis's nymphs, one of her inner circle, her hunting companions, one of the women who had sworn the same oath of independence and wildness that Artemis herself had sworn. She was, by all ancient accounts, one of the most devoted members of Artemis's company, a hunter of remarkable skill, deeply committed to the wildlife they shared on the mountains of Arcadia. And then Zeus, always Zeus, that inveterate complicator of other people's carefully arranged lives, intervened. The exact nature of Zeus's intervention varies by source, but the essential fact is this: Callisto became pregnant, which meant she had violated the oath that was the central condition of her place in Artemis's company. When the truth became apparent, in the most famous telling during a communal bathing scene in which Callisto's changed body could no longer be concealed, Artemis banished her from the group. This is the part of the story that modern readers find most difficult, because it is the part that looks, from the outside, like cruelty, a woman punished for something done to her, cast out by the community she loved and depended on for what was in many versions an act of violation rather than choice. And the ancient Greeks were themselves divided about this, which is why different versions of the story handle Callisto's fate so differently. Some are genuinely merciless. Others, and these are the ones I find most historically interesting, suggest that what looks like punishment was actually something else entirely. Because in the most complete version of Callisto's story, it is not Artemis who ultimately determines her fate. It is Zeus who transforms Callisto into a bear. Some say to hide her from Hera's wrath. Some say in response to Hera's demand for punishment. Callisto wanders the forests of Arcadia as a bear for years, and eventually her son Arcas, now grown, nearly kills her without recognizing her. The archetypal tragedy of a child who cannot see his own mother in the creature before him. And Zeus, in what is either a moment of genuine compassion or a particularly elaborate act of guilt management, places them both in the sky. Callisto as Ursa Major, the great bear, Arcas as Ursa Minor, the little bear, perpetually circling the North Star together, never setting below the horizon, always visible, always together. Artemis's role in this story is not the villain's, if you read it carefully. She enforces the rules of her community, rules that every member of that community had chosen freely and sworn to uphold. She does not pursue Callisto beyond that boundary. She does not add to her suffering. And in some versions of the myth, it is specifically Artemis who intervenes to prevent Arcas from killing the bear that is his mother, who recognizes Callisto even in her transformed state and acts to protect her. The huntress, again, as guardian. The goddess who enforces boundaries as the same goddess who protects the vulnerable within them. There is one more story from this chapter of Artemis's life that deserves our attention because it is both the most politically significant and the most geographically extraordinary of all her mythological encounters. It is the story of what happened at Aulis, the harbor where the Greek fleet gathered before sailing for Troy and found itself unable to move. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, high king of all the Greek forces, had committed a transgression. The exact nature of the transgression varies by source. In some versions, he killed a sacred deer in Artemis's grove. In others, he boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. In still others, he had made a vow to Artemis years before and forgotten to fulfill it. Whatever the specific cause, the result was absolute and unmistakable. The winds stopped. Every sailor in the ancient Mediterranean world understood what this meant. The winds were divine. When they stopped at the command of a god, they did not start again until that god was satisfied. The fleet sat at Aulis for months. Thousands of men, hundreds of ships, the greatest military force the Greek world had ever assembled. All of it made completely, humiliatingly powerless by the absence of wind. Agamemnon consulted the seer Calchas, who told him what Artemis required. Not a sacrifice of animals, not gold or silver or elaborate ritual offerings. She required something that would cost him something real, something that would demonstrate that he understood the weight of what he had violated. She required the sacrifice of his daughter Iphigenia. Here we arrive at one of the great moral abysses of ancient mythology. A story so dark and so painful, and so genuinely unresolved, that it spawned multiple contradictory endings across centuries of retelling, as if the ancient imagination itself could not quite accept the bleakest version and kept reaching for alternatives. In the earliest versions of the story, Iphigenia is brought to Aulis on the pretext of being married to the hero Achilles, She comes willingly, believing she is going to a wedding. What she finds instead is an altar and a priest, and her father's face wearing the expression of a man who has made a calculation and found his daughter on the wrong side of it. The Greek tragedy Iphigenia at Aulis by Euripides, written in the late 5th century BCE, is one of the most devastating plays in the entire Western theatrical tradition, precisely because Euripides does not simplify this moment. He shows us Iphigenia's terror and her eventual agonized decision to accept her fate. He shows us Agamemnon's self-justifications. He shows us Clytemnestra, Iphigenia's mother, who will carry this moment forward into the future like a knife she is sharpening for the rest of her life. He shows us the machinery of military necessity grinding down over individual human dignity and finding it, in the final terrible accounting, lighter than the goal it is weighed against. And then, in the versions of the story that the ancient Greeks seem to have preferred, the versions that appear most consistently across the widest range of sources, the versions that later became the basis for Iphigenia in Tauris, Euripides' extraordinary companion play, something happens at the last moment. As the knife descends, Artemis substitutes a deer for the girl. Iphigenia vanishes from the altar in a blaze of divine light and finds herself breathless, bewildered, alive, in the far country of Tauris on the shores of the Black Sea, where she will serve as Artemis's priestess for years before her brother Orestes comes to find her. What are we to make of this? The goddess who demanded the sacrifice also prevented it. The divine force that required a cost also, at the final moment, declined to collect that particular payment. The huntress who shoots without missing chose, in this one extraordinary case, to miss on purpose. Scholars have debated this contradiction for centuries, and I think the most honest thing to say is that it is not, ultimately, a contradiction at all. It is a portrait of a divine principle that is genuinely, fundamentally concerned with the protection of the innocent. Iphigenia had done nothing wrong. She was not Agamemnon. She had not killed the deer, or made the boast, or broken the vow. The punishment that Agamemnon had earned was his to suffer, and he did suffer it, in ways that rippled forward through the rest of his life and the lives of everyone around him. But Iphigenia was not a payment to be collected. She was a person. And Artemis, the goddess who had spent her divine life protecting the young, the vulnerable, the creatures who could not protect themselves, was not, in the end, willing to let her be used as one. The winds blew, the fleet sailed, Troy burned, and Iphigenia lived in a cold country far from home, serving a goddess who had saved her life at the cost of turning it entirely in a direction she had never chosen, which is its own kind of ambiguous mercy. These are the stories of those who tested Artemis, Actaeon, who stumbled into sacred space, Orion, who was invited in and lost anyway, Callisto, who kept faith with the wrong world, Agamemnon, who forgot what it meant to owe a debt to a goddess. Each of them found, in their own way, that the wild world has rules that hold whether or not you know them, whether or not you meant to break them, whether or not you think you are important enough for them to apply to you. Each of them discovered that Artemis was not a symbol or a story or a distant divine abstraction. She was a real force in the real world, and she moved through it with the same precision and the same inevitability as moonlight moving across a forest floor, not asking permission, not explaining herself, not apologizing for the shadows she left behind. But she was also, in that extraordinary moment at Aulis, something more than a force of cosmic correction. She was a protector. She was a being who looked at a young woman standing at an altar with a knife above her head and decided, against all the terrible momentum of the situation, that this particular young life was worth more than the theological tidiness of making the punishment fit the crime. She was, in the end, exactly what she had been in her very first hour of existence, the one who stands between the vulnerable and the dark. Outside your window, the night is at its deepest point now, that hour when even the owls have grown quiet, when the forest is as still as it ever becomes, when the stars have completed their arc and are beginning imperceptibly to tilt toward morning. This is Artemis's hour. This is the hour she has always owned. Not the bright, confident hours of midday, not the social hours of early evening, but this particular darkness just before the first suggestion of dawn, when the world is simultaneously at its most silent and its most alive. Begin, as the ancient travelers did, from the sea. You are approaching the Aegean coast of Asia Minor, modern Turkey, from the water, sometime in the 5th century BCE, when the temple at Ephesus was already centuries old and already famous across the entire known world. The coastline you are approaching is not what we would see today. The harbor at Ephesus silted up long ago, and the sea has retreated several kilometers from where it once stood, leaving the ruins of the ancient city stranded inland like a ship that ran aground and was never refloated. But in the 5th century BCE, the sea came right to the edge of the city, and the temple, the great temple, the one that would be listed among the wonders of the world, was visible from the water long before you could see any other feature of the coast. Ancient sources describe arriving at Ephesus from the sea with a consistency that suggests genuine experience rather than literary convention. You saw the temple first. Before the city walls, before the harbor installations, before the merchant ships and the fishing boats and all the ordinary paraphernalia of a busy ancient port, you saw the temple, white and gold against the green hills behind it, its columns rising above everything else the way a mountain rises above the foothills. 127 columns of Parian marble, each one 18 meters high, arranged in a double row that created a forest of stone around the central sanctuary. The temple itself was approximately 115 meters long and 55 meters wide, roughly the footprint of a modern football field, which gives you a sense of the scale, though the comparison feels inadequate and faintly absurd, the way all modern comparisons to ancient sacred spaces feel inadequate and faintly absurd. The architect of the first great temple at Ephesus, the one that was later burned and rebuilt on an even grander scale, was a man named Chersiphron of Knossos, a Cretan architect who solved the problem of transporting enormous marble columns from the quarry to the building site with an ingenuity so elegant it has been admired by engineers ever since. He did not drag the columns on sledges, the way most ancient builders moved heavy stone shaft, turning them into enormous rollers, and had them pulled across the flat coastal plain by oxen, the columns rotating slowly inside their wooden frames as they moved. The result was that the marble column rolled to the building site rather than being dragged to it, reducing the friction and the labor required by an enormous factor. When he arrived at the site and saw what he had done, saw the first column standing upright in its position, plumb and true, and catching the Aegean light, Chersiphron reportedly wept. The ancient sources do not tell us whether he wept from exhaustion or from beauty. Perhaps, as is so often the case with the greatest human achievements, it was both at once. The temple took 120 years to build in its first great iteration. 120 years of continuous labor, continuous refinement, continuous accumulation of skill and intention and divine purpose. Generations of workers were born, grew old and died in the shadow of a building that was not yet finished. Their children and their children's children continued the work. The temple at Ephesus was not built by a single generation with a single vision. It was built by a community that had committed itself to something larger than any individual life, something that would outlast everyone involved in making it. This kind of multi-generational sacred building project was not unique in the ancient world. The great cathedrals of medieval Europe were built the same way, for the same reason. But it was extraordinarily rare, and the commitment it required tells us something profound about how seriously the people of Ephesus took their relationship with the goddess at the center of it all. Who was that goddess? Here is where the story becomes most interesting and most complex. The Artemis of Ephesus was not quite the same goddess as the silver bow huntress of Arcadia. She was related to her, deeply, genealogically, spiritually related, but she was also older, stranger, more ancient in her power, rooted in a layer of religious history that predated the Olympian gods entirely. Her cult statue, the famous image that stood in the innermost sanctuary of the temple, the one that pilgrims traveled from the ends of the earth to see, was not a silver girl with a bow and hunting hounds. It was something altogether different and altogether extraordinary. The statue of Artemis of Ephesus, of which numerous copies survive in museum collections around the world, the best in the Naples Archaeological Museum and the Ephesus Museum in Selçuk, Turkey, shows a figure that stops every first-time viewer in their tracks. She is upright, formal, frontal, her arms extended outward in a gesture of embrace or offering, or both. Her lower body is encased in a tight column decorated with bands of sacred animals: bulls, bees, lions, sphinxes, deer, arranged in horizontal registers like the illuminated pages of a sacred text written in the language of the natural world. Her upper body is covered with what were long described in a combination of confusion and Victorian squeamishness as multiple breasts, rows and rows of rounded protuberances covering her chest and torso like a strange organic armor. Modern scholarship has largely revised this interpretation. The objects covering her upper body are now believed, on the basis of close material analysis, to be not breasts at all, but the scrota of sacrificed bulls, offerings to the goddess incorporated directly into her sacred image, a visual record of worship made permanent in bronze and marble. This interpretation, which was controversial when first proposed and is still debated, transforms the statue from a symbol of fecundity in the simple, obvious sense into something far more complex and far more ancient, a record of the accumulated devotion of thousands of worshippers, each act of sacrifice literally embedded in the body of the goddess they were sacrificing to. The boundary between worshipper and worshipped, between the gift and the recipient of the gift, dissolved into a single material object that was both simultaneously. Whatever the correct interpretation of her iconography, and the debate continues, the goddess of Ephesus was clearly something ancient and powerful and multiple in her meanings. She was a goddess of fertility and abundance, yes, but also of wild nature, of the boundary between the tamed and the untamed, of the sea and the land, and the space between them. She was Artemis, and she was also something older than Artemis, something that the Greeks had encountered when they arrived in Asia Minor and found a pre-existing cult of a great nature goddess who had been worshipped on that particular piece of coastline since before the Greek language existed. They did what the ancient Greeks typically did when they encountered foreign gods. They recognized them. They said, "We know this. This is one of ours. and they grafted their own Artemis onto the ancient Anatolian goddess and created something new from the combination, something that was entirely neither one nor the other, but more powerful than either alone. The Greeks had a word for this process of divine recognition and synthesis, interpretatio Graeca, and it was one of their great cultural gifts to the ancient world. Rather than destroying the religious traditions they encountered as they expanded across the Mediterranean and beyond, they absorbed them, translated them, found the familiar divine principle underneath the unfamiliar surface. The Artemis of Ephesus was the result of one of the most successful of these translations, a goddess who was simultaneously Greek and Anatolian, simultaneously Olympic and ancient, simultaneously the huntress of Arcadia and the mother of all wild things on the coast of Asia Minor. The temple was destroyed. Of course it was destroyed. Everything built by human hands is eventually destroyed. And the more beautiful the thing, the more determined history seems to be to demonstrate this point. But the destruction of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus was not the ordinary slow dissolution of time and neglect. It was dramatic. It was deliberate. And the story of its destruction is one of the most psychologically revealing episodes in the entire history of the ancient world. On the night of July 21st, 356 BCE, and here I want you to notice something, because the ancient sources noticed it too and thought it enormously significant. A man named Herostratus walked into the temple of Artemis at Ephesus carrying fire and burned it to the ground. Not the whole temple. The outer columns survived, and the sanctuary walls, and the great altar. But the inner temple, the wooden roof structure, and the centuries of accumulated dedications and offerings and artistic masterpieces that had been placed in the goddess's care by every important person in the Mediterranean world for 500 years. All of it burned in a single night. Herostratus, when captured, confessed immediately and explained his motivation with a directness that has haunted historians ever since. He burned the temple, he said, because he wanted to be remembered. He had no other qualification for immortality, no military victories, no artistic achievements, no philosophical contributions, no acts of genuine excellence of any kind. But he had a torch and access to a wooden roof, and he calculated correctly that destroying one of the most famous buildings in the world would ensure that his name survived. The Ephesian authorities, recognizing exactly what he had done, responded with a decree that was, in its own way, as psychologically sophisticated as the crime it was responding to. They forbade anyone to speak Herostratus's name, ever, under pain of death. They attempted to erase him from history by legislative force, to give him the opposite of what he had sought, to make him not immortal, but invisible. It did not work. It has never worked. The name of Herostratus is known today precisely because it was forbidden to speak it, preserved in the historical record, specifically because the Ephesians tried so hard to remove it. The ancient historian Theopompus recorded both the name and the prohibition, explaining his reasoning with a weary pragmatism. The prohibition itself was noteworthy, and therefore the name had to be recorded in order to explain the prohibition. History, as it turns out, is extremely difficult to prevent. There is a lesson here about the nature of fame and infamy that the ancient world understood, and that remains uncomfortably relevant. That the desire for recognition is so powerful in human beings that some will destroy the most beautiful things in the world to satisfy it, and that the attempt to deny that recognition, however justified, tends to produce the opposite of its intended effect. Herostratus wanted to be remembered. He is remembered. The temple he burned was rebuilt, grander, more magnificent, more definitively one of the wonders of the world than its predecessor. And yet it is his name, and not the names of the architects and craftsmen and donors who rebuilt it, that most people who know the story remember first. Artemis presumably had thoughts about all of this. Ancient sources record that she was absent from Ephesus on the night of the fire. Specifically, that she was away attending the birth of Alexander the Great, who was born that same night in Macedon. The story is almost certainly a later invention, the kind of explanatory mythology that attaches itself to coincidences and makes them mean something. But it is a revealing invention, because it suggests that the ancient imagination could not quite accept the idea that Artemis had simply failed to protect her own temple. She must have been elsewhere, doing something more important. The goddess who protected the young and vulnerable was busy that night at the birth of the boy who would grow up to conquer the known world. She had her priorities. The rebuilding of the temple took decades and involved contributions from every significant power in the ancient Mediterranean world, up to and including Alexander himself, who famously offered to pay for the entire reconstruction in exchange for having his name inscribed on the temple as its donor. The Ephesians declined, with a diplomatic tact that has been admired ever since. They told Alexander that it was not fitting for one god to dedicate a temple to another. It was, by any standard, an extraordinary refusal, turning down the richest and most powerful man in the world, the man who had just conquered Persia and Egypt, and was in the process of rewriting the political geography of the entire ancient world, and doing it with a compliment so elegant that Alexander could not reasonably take offense. He left Ephesus without his inscription and without his refund, and the Ephesians rebuilt their temple with their own resources and their own faith and their own centuries of accumulated devotion to the goddess at the center of it all. The rebuilt temple was, by all ancient accounts, even more magnificent than the original. It was included in the canonical list of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, a list compiled by various ancient scholars in the 2nd century BCE as a guide for sophisticated travelers, the ancient world's equivalent of a must-see list. And it appears to have deserved its place on that list more than almost anything else on it. Unlike the other wonders, many of which were primarily monuments to human power and ambition, the pyramids, the mausoleum, the Colossus. The Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was built for a purpose that transcended any individual ego. It was built for worship. It was built because a community of people believed, with everything they had, that the divine feminine principle of the natural world deserved the most beautiful house that human hands could construct. And they built it twice. The philosopher Antipater of Sidon, who compiled one of the earliest versions of the 7 wonders list, described seeing the temple for the first time with a wonder that is still palpable across 2,000 years of textual transmission. He wrote that when he saw the great temple, the other wonders seemed diminished, that the pyramids and the hanging gardens and all the rest of them were remarkable but explicable, the products of extraordinary human effort in service of human ambition. But the Temple of Artemis seemed to him to belong to a different category of thing entirely, something that had not merely been built, but had somehow grown, the way a forest grows, the way mountains grow, with a patience and a rightness that exceeded any individual human intention. He was, in this observation, accidentally describing the nature of Artemis herself, the sense that she was not a deity constructed by human theology, but a principle discovered by human experience, something that had always been there. that the worship simply recognized rather than created. Ephesus was not only a religious center, it was one of the greatest cities in the ancient world, a trading hub, an intellectual center, a cosmopolitan metropolis where Greek and Persian and Anatolian and Egyptian and Jewish and eventually Roman cultures met and mingled and argued and created. At its height, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE under Roman rule, it had a population of between 200 and 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world, comparable in scale to Rome itself. The Library of Celsus, whose facade still stands in remarkable preservation and has become one of the great iconic images of classical archaeology, held 12,000 scrolls. The great theater carved into the hillside could seat 25,000 spectators. The marble street that ran from the harbor to the city center, the Aegean, still visible in aerial photographs of the site, was lined with columns and shops and the kind of confident urban architecture that announces a city entirely certain of its own importance. And at the center of all this, at the heart of this great cosmopolitan city, this meeting place of civilizations, this library and theater and marketplace and port, was the temple, the goddess, the ancient principle of the wild feminine, the huntress and protector and guardian of boundaries, translated into the language of Hellenistic urban sophistication without losing any of her essential wildness. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Artemis of Ephesus, that she could contain these apparent contradictions without strain. She was ancient and sophisticated, wild and civilized, Greek and Anatolian, a huntress and a mother, a virgin and a fertility goddess. She was all of these things simultaneously, without apology, without the need to resolve the contradictions into a single coherent theological position. She simply held them all, the way a great forest holds 1,000 different species simultaneously. The predators and the prey, the ancient trees and the new growth, the decay and the germination, all of it together, all of it necessary, all of it part of the same continuous living fact. The city of Ephesus understood this. The city was arranged physically and economically and socially around the principle of the goddess. The great religious festivals of Artemis at Ephesus, particularly the Artemisia, celebrated every spring with processions and sacrifices and athletic competitions and artistic performances, were not simply religious observances. They were economic events, cultural events, political events, occasions that drew pilgrims and merchants and diplomats from across the entire ancient world. The economy of Ephesus was, in significant part, an economy built on the manufacture and sale of devotional objects related to Artemis: small silver shrines, ceramic figurines, votive offerings of every description. When the Christian missionary Paul visited Ephesus in approximately 50 CE and preached against the worship of idols, the silversmith Demetrius organized a riot, not primarily out of religious conviction, but out of genuine economic anxiety. His trade, the making of silver shrines of Artemis, was threatened. His workers and their families depended on the continued devotion of pilgrims. The story, which Paul himself recounts in Acts 19, is one of the most vivid portraits in ancient literature of the intersection between religion and economics, between sacred devotion and commercial interest, between the old world and the new. The crowd that gathered in the theater, 25,000 people shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians," for 2 hours without stopping, according to the Acts account, was expressing something more complex than simple religious fervor. They were expressing the fear of a community that had organized its entire identity, its economy, its culture, and its sense of itself around a single central sacred fact, and now saw that fact under threat. They were expressing the terror of the edge of the world suddenly moving inward. The temple was destroyed again. Of course it was. This time it was the Goths, in 268 CE, who sacked Ephesus and burned what remained of the sanctuary. By this point, the temple had already been declining for centuries. The silting of the harbor had reduced Ephesus's economic importance. The rise of Christianity had eroded the theological basis for the cult, and the accumulated weight of historical change had done what historical change always does to everything eventually. The great columns fell. The marble was quarried for new buildings, including the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, which incorporates columns from the Temple of Artemis among its 104 supporting columns. A fact that feels either like a profound irony or a profound continuity, depending on how you choose to read the relationship between the religious traditions involved. Today, the site of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus is a flat field on the edge of the modern town of Selçuk in western Turkey, marked by a single reconstructed column standing alone in a marshy depression. Around its base, fragments of the original carved column drums that once formed the lowest sections of the great columns lie in disorganized heaps, partially submerged in water when the season is wet. The column itself, this single lonely marker, is topped with a stork's nest, occupied every spring when the storks return from their African wintering grounds to breed. When archaeologists first raised this reconstructed column in 1972, they did not plan the nest. The storks planned it themselves, arriving the following spring and beginning construction, with the calm assumption that this tall structure, in the middle of a flat field, was exactly the kind of place they required. I find this detail, the storks on the column, one of the most genuinely moving things in the entire story of Artemis and her temple. Because Artemis was always the goddess of wild things claiming their natural habitat. She was always the principle of the non-human world asserting itself over human construction, reminding us that our buildings are temporary and the birds that nest in their ruins are indifferent to our civilizations. The great temple is gone. The city is ruins. The harbor is a field. And the storks come back every spring to the single remaining column, because a tall structure in an open field is exactly what they need, and they are not interested in anything else about it. Artemis, one feels, would approve entirely. But before we leave Ephesus, before we leave this remarkable city and its remarkable goddess and the extraordinary 3,000-year conversation between human devotion and divine wildness that the temple represents, there is one more story to tell, one more thread to follow into the dark. Among the many thousands of pilgrims who visited the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus over the centuries, there was a tradition of seeking asylum. The temple precinct was sacred ground, inviolable, protected, outside the jurisdiction of any civil or military authority. A person who reached the temple and placed their hands on the altar of Artemis was, in the religious and legal understanding of the ancient world, untouchable. Slave or free, criminal or innocent, citizen or foreigner. The moment you crossed into Artemis's precinct, you were under her protection, and to remove you by force was an act of sacrilege that no sensible person or army was willing to risk. This asylum tradition was ancient and widespread. Many Greek temples offered it, but the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus was particularly famous for it, partly because of the temple's enormous size and prestige, and partly because the goddess's reputation as a protector of the vulnerable was so firmly established in the ancient imagination. Generations of desperate people, escaped slaves, political refugees, debtors fleeing their creditors, women fleeing their families, soldiers fleeing their commanders, made their way to the precinct of Artemis and placed themselves under her protection. The temple fed them from its considerable resources, maintained by the accumulated wealth of centuries of donations. The priests administered the precinct as a kind of sacred city within the city, with its own rules, its own economy, its own carefully maintained boundaries. The boundaries of the asylum precinct were not fixed. They were renegotiated repeatedly over the centuries, expanding and contracting as different political powers tried to manage the practical consequences of a large, well-funded sacred space that was officially outside their authority. When Mark Antony arrived in Ephesus in the 40s BCE, flush with the aftermath of the assassination of Julius Caesar, in the process of organizing the Eastern Mediterranean to his advantage, he expanded the asylum boundaries significantly, which had the immediate practical effect of making large portions of the city officially off limits to his own soldiers' enforcement activities. It was a political gesture, a way of demonstrating his piety and his respect for the goddess, while simultaneously complicating the administrative lives of everyone trying to run the city. The Ephesians were deeply ambivalent about it. Augustus, when he arrived in Ephesus a decade later, as the undisputed ruler of the Roman world, contracted the boundaries again. He was a more pragmatic man than Antony in most respects, and he understood that a sacred precinct the size of a small city was an administrative problem that piety alone could not solve. He negotiated with the priests, walked the boundary, and reduced the asylum zone to something manageable. The goddess apparently accepted this arrangement. What strikes me about the asylum tradition, what has always struck scholars who study it carefully, is the light it throws on the practical, daily function of Artemis's worship in the lives of ordinary ancient people. We spend a great deal of time when we study ancient religion looking at the spectacular aspects, the great temples, the famous myths, the elaborate festival rituals. But the asylum tradition reminds us that the goddess was also, continuously and practically, a resource for the most desperate and most powerless members of ancient society. She was a last resort, a final refuge, the place you went when every other option had been exhausted, when every human protection had failed or been withdrawn, when the only thing standing between you and the worst that could happen was the reputation of a goddess who had been protecting the vulnerable since before the city was built. She was still, in other words, 3 years old on the knee of Zeus, asking for exactly what she had always needed. Not just a bow and a forest and a group of hunting companions, not just the wilderness and the mountains and the silver moon above them. She had asked, in that original divine negotiation, to be the one who helped those in need, a helper in childbirth, she had specified, along with all her other requests. And she had kept that promise across 3,000 years of worship with a consistency that puts most divine promises to shame. The huntress and the refuge, the punisher and the protector, the cold silver arrow and the open door of the sacred precinct. These are not contradictions. They are the same principle expressed from different angles, the principle of a world in balance, where what you take is returned, where every threshold has a guardian, where the wild and the vulnerable are held in the same careful hands. The night is nearly done now. Not quite. There is still a dark hour before the first birds begin, before the sky lightens at the eastern edge from black to the deep blue that precedes the deep blue that precedes the first gray that precedes the rose that precedes the gold. But the deepest part is past. The world is beginning, somewhere very quietly and very far away, to think about morning. Somewhere in western Turkey, in the flat marshy field that was once the greatest temple in the ancient world, the single reconstructed column stands in darkness. The storks are sleeping on their nest at the top of it. Those great white birds with their red bills and their complete indifference to human history, resting on the highest point available, because that is what storks do. Because the world provides what is needed if you are paying attention. Around the base of the column, the water from the winter rains has collected in the depression, reflecting the last stars. The 7 wonders of the ancient world were chosen because they exceeded human expectation, because they represented the furthest reach of human achievement, the points where the species had strained furthest towards something it could barely name, but could not stop trying to build. 6 of the 7 are gone now, surviving only in descriptions and fragments and the persistent human need to imagine what they looked like. The temple of Artemis is gone too. That single column is not the temple. It is a memorial to the temple, a marker saying here once something extraordinary stood. But the principle that the temple was built to honor, the wild feminine force at the heart of the natural world, the guardian of boundaries and protector of the vulnerable, the silver arrow that always finds its mark, that is not gone. It is in the storks on the column. It is in the wolves still moving through the mountains of the Peloponnese. It is in every forest that has not yet been cleared, every river that has not yet been straightened, every piece of the wild world that has survived the accumulated weight of human civilization and is still stubbornly, beautifully, improbably itself. She is still there, at the edge of things, watching the boundary between the known and the unknown, the tame and the wild, the day and the night. Silver bow in hand, hounds at her feet, the stars above her making the shape of a hunter she once loved and placed there herself, out of grief too large for any other container. Not in the small, everyday sense of staying true to your preferences or maintaining your routines. In the largest sense. In the sense of a divine principle that has existed for 3,000 years across dozens of cultures and hundreds of languages and countless historical upheavals, that has been worshipped and reinterpreted and appropriated and forgotten and rediscovered and renamed and feared and loved, and that has, through all of it, retained something essential, something recognizable, something that, when you encounter it at the right moment and in the right light, you know immediately. You do not need to be told what it is. You simply know, the way you know when you have walked far enough into a forest that you can no longer hear the road behind you, that you are somewhere real, somewhere that does not require your participation to exist, somewhere that was here before you and will be here after you and is, in the most fundamental sense, itself. That quality, that irreducible selfhood, that divine insistence on being exactly what you are, regardless of what the world around you needs or demands or believes you should be, is what Artemis has always represented. And in this final chapter, I want to follow that quality forward through time, through the centuries that came after the great temple fell, and the old gods were officially retired, and the world reorganized itself around new divine principles. I want to see what happened to Artemis when no one was supposed to be worshiping her anymore. I want to see what became of the huntress when the hunt was over, because she did not disappear. She never disappears. She simply changes her name. Begin with the moment of transition, because transitions are always more interesting than the stable periods on either side of them. The official end of the worship of the Greek and Roman gods is usually dated to 391 CE, when the Emperor Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica, making Christianity the official state religion of the Roman Empire, and prohibiting the practice of the old pagan religions under pain of severe legal penalty. Temples were closed, sacrifices were forbidden. The great oracles fell silent. The Pythia at Delphi gave her last prophecy sometime in the late 4th century and was not replaced. The sacred fires that had burned continuously in certain shrines for centuries were extinguished. The priests and priestesses of the old gods were given a choice between conversion and marginalization, and most of them, being practical people living in a practical world, chose conversion. On paper, this is where the story of Artemis ends. The worship of the goddess was illegal, her temples were repurposed, the Parthenon in Athens, dedicated to her sister Athena, became a Christian church, and later a mosque, and is now a tourist site with scaffolding on it. The temple at Ephesus was already a ruin. The sacred groves of Artemis across the Greek world were cut down or consecrated to new purposes. The institutional infrastructure of the goddess's worship, the priests, the festivals, the sacrifices, the oracle traditions, was dismantled systematically and replaced with the infrastructure of the new religion. And yet the stories did not stop being told. The images did not stop being made. The sacred places, the high mountains, the deep forests, the wild coastlines, the springs that rose from darkness into light, did not stop being felt as sacred. The human need that Artemis had always served, the need for a divine presence in the wild places, a sacred principle in the non-human world, a guardian of the boundary between civilization and wilderness, did not evaporate because the theology changed. What happened instead was something that the historical record captures only partially and imperfectly, because it happened largely outside the institutions that kept records, in villages, in forests, in the unofficial religious practice of ordinary people who had been told their gods were gone, but who could still feel, on a moonlit night in a forest clearing, that something was present that had not received the imperial memo about its own retirement. The goddess went underground, not literally, though in some cases almost literally, her worship continuing in caves and remote mountain sanctuaries long after it was officially forbidden. She went underground in the more profound sense of becoming embedded in the cultural landscape in ways that were officially invisible but practically continuous. She became a folk memory, a habit of sacred attention, a way of relating to the non-human world that persisted in the nervous system of European culture long after its theological justification had been removed. The clearest evidence of this underground persistence is the phenomenon that historians of religion call syncretism, the blending of old religious forms with new ones, the way water finds a way through apparently solid rock by working along the grain of the stone. In the early centuries of Christianity's expansion through the Greek and Roman world, the new religion encountered a problem that its theologians discussed with considerable anxiety. The people who converted brought their old sacred landscape with them. They stopped sacrificing to Artemis, yes. They stopped calling the goddess by her name. But they continued to feel that certain springs were sacred, that certain groves required respect, that the full moon had a particular quality of power, that wild animals deserved a special kind of attention. They continued to seek the protection of a divine feminine presence for women in childbirth, for young girls on the threshold of adulthood, for travelers in wild places. The need was still there. The goddess, officially, was not. The solution that emerged, organically, over centuries, through thousands of individual local negotiations between the old sacred landscape and the new theological framework was to find Christian figures who could absorb the functions and the sacred geography of the old gods. Not replace them exactly, absorb them, stand in the same places and answer the same prayers and address the same human needs under different names. The most important of these absorptions, for our purposes, was the Christianization of Artemis's sacred sites and sacred functions through the figure of the Virgin Mary. This is not a fringe academic theory. It is one of the most thoroughly documented processes in the history of religion, acknowledged by scholars across the theological spectrum. The evidence is everywhere, once you know how to read it. The most famous example is Ephesus itself. After the fall of the Great Temple, the city of Ephesus became one of the most important sites in early Christianity. Specifically, it became associated with the Virgin Mary, who was believed in Christian tradition to have spent her final years there under the protection of the Apostle John. In 431 CE, the Council of Ephesus, one of the foundational councils of Christian theology, met in the city specifically to debate and affirm the title of Theotokos for Mary, meaning God-bearer or Mother of God. This is the council that officially established Mary's elevated status in Christian devotion. The scholars of religion who have studied this carefully note that the title Theotokos and the elevated intercessory role it implies for Mary bears a striking resemblance to the role of Artemis in her Ephesian form, the great mother goddess, the divine feminine protector, the sacred figure to whom ordinary people brought their most desperate prayers. The Council of Ephesus did not meet in Rome, where the Pope was. It did not meet in Constantinople, where the Emperor was. It met in Ephesus, in the city of Artemis, on the ground already saturated with 3,000 years of devotion to a divine feminine principle. And it made a decision that would shape the character of Christian devotion for the next 2,000 years. The sacred landscape absorbed the new theology. The new theology, in absorbing it, was itself transformed. The boundary between the old religion and the new was not a wall, but a membrane, permeable, gradual, continuous. Follow Artemis further north and west, into the forests of Europe that the Romans never fully tamed and the early Christian missionaries found genuinely terrifying. In the Germanic and Celtic and Slavic traditions that Christianity encountered as it spread through northern Europe, it found a different but recognizable version of the same divine principle. The wild feminine presence in the forest, the goddess of the hunt, the guardian of wild animals and wild places. The names were different. The specific mythological details were different. But the essential function, the sacred principle that held the wild world in balance, that required respect and reciprocity from those who entered it, that protected the boundary between the human and the non-human, was recognizably continuous with what Artemis had always been. In the Germanic world, she appeared as Holda, the wild woman of the forest who led the winter hunt through the night sky, who blessed those who respected the natural world and punished those who violated it. In the Celtic tradition, she echoed in the figure of the great hunting goddesses who guarded sacred groves and demanded that the human world acknowledge its debt to the non-human one. In the Slavic tradition, she appeared as Diana Divana, her Roman name so thoroughly embedded in the Slavic divine landscape that it became almost indistinguishable from the indigenous goddess it had been overlaid onto. The Roman name Diana, Artemis's Roman equivalent, proved particularly durable, particularly resistant to the theological changes that swept away most of the official divine infrastructure. Diana persisted in the European imagination with a tenacity that the ecclesiastical authorities found deeply frustrating. Church documents from the early medieval period are full of prohibitions against the worship of Diana, against making offerings in sacred groves, against invoking her name at the full moon, against the persistent folk belief in a goddess who led a company of women through the night forest on a hunt that was simultaneously literal and supernatural. The figure that medieval church documents called Diana, the night huntress, the leader of the wild hunt, the goddess of the forest moon, was not by the medieval period purely the Roman Diana. She was an accumulation. She was Artemis from Greece and Diana from Rome and Holda from Germany and a dozen other local divine presences, all collapsed into a single figure that the official theology could not quite eradicate because she was answering a need that the official theology had not found a way to meet. She became, eventually, one of the central figures in what historians call the European witch tradition. The vast, complex, poorly understood, heavily persecuted folk religious culture that coexisted uneasily with official Christianity throughout the medieval period. The women who were accused of witchcraft in medieval and early modern Europe were accused, among other things, of attending nocturnal gatherings in forest clearings, of riding through the night sky in the company of a mysterious female leader, of making offerings to a divine feminine presence that the church identified as demonic, but that the practitioners themselves, to the extent that we can recover their perspective, seem to have understood as the continuation of something very old and very real. The historian Carlo Ginzburg, in his extraordinary scholarly detective work, Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, traces this nocturnal feminine cult across centuries and cultures and finds, underneath all the layers of ecclesiastical distortion and theological anxiety, the continuous thread of a very ancient religious tradition, a tradition of ecstatic contact with the divine feminine principle of the wild world that stretches back through Roman Diana and Greek Artemis to the pre-Greek goddess of wild nature who was worshipped on the coast of Asia Minor before the temple at Ephesus was built. The silver arrow flies through 3,000 years of history and lands, still true, still accurate, in the forest clearings of medieval Europe. The huntress is still running. She simply changed her name. The Renaissance brought her back into the light. When the scholars and artists of 15th and 16th century Europe rediscovered the classical world, dusted off the manuscripts, excavated the sculptures, fell in love all over again with the luminous intellectual culture of ancient Greece and Rome, they rediscovered Artemis with particular enthusiasm. She appeared everywhere in Renaissance art with the speed and frequency of someone who had been waiting a long time to be invited back in. She appeared in Titian's paintings. Diana and Actaeon, Diana and Callisto, painted in the 1550s for Philip II of Spain, are among the most psychologically complex and most visually extraordinary paintings of the entire Renaissance. Images that take the ancient myths we explored in Chapter 3 and render them in flesh and light with a sensuality and a moral weight that neither sanitizes the stories nor reduces them to simple entertainment. Titian's Diana is not a symbol. She is a being, powerful, dangerous, sovereign, the full complexity of the ancient goddess present in every carefully observed detail. She appeared in the poetry of the period with an insistence that suggests she was meeting a real need in the Renaissance imagination, the need for a divine principle that was feminine but not passive, sacred but not domestic, powerful but not defined by her relationship to masculine power. In a world where the dominant Christian feminine ideal was defined by submission and sacrifice, Artemis offered something different: sovereignty. The divine feminine that belonged to itself, that had negotiated its own terms with the King of Heaven before it was 3 years old, that ran through the world on its own authority and answered to nothing and no one. Elizabeth I of England understood this perfectly, which is why she cultivated the image of Artemis, specifically the Artemis-Diana connection, as one of the central mythological frameworks for her own unprecedented political identity. She was the Virgin Queen, Virgo, the Latin word that connects directly to the Greek Parthenos, the same word in the name of the Parthenon, the temple dedicated to Artemis's virgin sister, Athena. She was the queen who hunted, the queen who remained unmarried in the face of enormous political pressure to the contrary, the queen who governed alone and governed successfully and insisted on her own divine authority in terms that drew explicitly on the tradition of Artemis. Her court painters depicted her as Diana. Her court poets compared her to the moon goddess. Her court masks enacted the mythology of the virgin huntress with a political precision that left no one in any doubt about the theological argument being made. The argument was this: a woman can be sovereign, a woman can be powerful, a woman can be complete in herself, without a husband, without children, without the domestic and reproductive roles that the prevailing culture insisted were the definition of feminine existence. The goddess has always said so. Look, she said so to Zeus himself before she was 3 years old, on the mountain where she was born, and he gave her everything she asked for. She asked for herself. He gave it to her. The precedent exists. The divine law is clear. Elizabeth was not the last woman to make this argument by invoking Artemis. She was not even close to the last. The goddess has been invoked in every subsequent century by women who needed a divine precedent for their own sovereignty, their own refusal to be defined by their relationship to others, their own insistence on the full complexity of feminine existence. She has been invoked by artists and writers and activists and ordinary women who simply, in the quiet of their own private experience, recognized something in the huntress that corresponded to something true in themselves. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries returned to Artemis from yet another angle, the angle of the wild natural world itself, which the Romantics were the first post-classical European culture to experience as genuinely sacred rather than merely picturesque. Wordsworth walking alone on the mountains of the Lake District, Keats writing Endymion, his long, aching poem about the moon goddess's love for a sleeping shepherd, which is as much about the yearning of the human imagination for contact with the divine as it is about any specific mythological story. Shelley's great hymns to the moon, the German Romantics' passionate engagement with the forest as a place of spiritual encounter rather than economic resource. All of this was, in its deepest impulse, a rediscovery of what the ancient Greeks had known when they built the first shrine to Artemis in a mountain grove, that the non-human world is not merely background, it is presence, it has agency, it demands a certain quality of attention from those who enter it. The Romantics could not quite name this. They did not have the theological framework for it. The old framework had been demolished, and the new Romantic spirituality was still assembling itself from fragments of classical mythology and Christian mysticism and proto-scientific nature observation. But they felt it, and they wrote about what they felt with an intensity that still communicates across 2 centuries of subsequent cultural change. They felt, in the wild places, the presence of something that was not God in the Christian sense, and not simply nature in the scientific sense, but something in between, or rather something that refused the distinction, something that was simultaneously the physical world and the sacred principle within it. They were, without quite knowing it, feeling Artemis. The goddess of wild places was still in her wild places, 2,000 years after her last official worshipper had converted to Christianity, and the Romantic poets were sensitive enough and honest enough to report what they actually felt, rather than what the prevailing theology said they should feel. Follow the thread further forward, the 20th century. The first wave of modern feminism, emerging in the early 20th century, found in the figure of Artemis a powerful mythological resource for thinking about feminine autonomy and feminine power. The second wave, erupting in the 1960s and 1970s, found her even more useful and more urgent. The goddess who had refused domestication, who had chosen the wilderness over the city, who had organized her life around her own purposes rather than anyone else's needs, who had demanded and received sovereignty from the patriarchal king of heaven himself. This was a figure who spoke directly to the experience of women trying to articulate, in the face of enormous cultural resistance, their right to exist on their own terms. The classic scholar and mythologist Karl Karenyi, writing in the 1940s, produced a portrait of Artemis that has influenced every subsequent scholar in the field, one that insists on the goddess's radical originality, her refusal to be reduced to any single symbolic function, her irreducible complexity. The psychologist Carl Jung and his followers, particularly the Jungian analyst Jean Shinoda Bolen, in her influential 1984 book Goddesses in Every Woman, developed the figure of Artemis as an archetypal pattern in the human psyche. Specifically, the pattern of what Bolen called the focused consciousness archetype, the feminine principle that pursues its own goals with concentrated intention, that finds its deepest fulfillment in achievement and autonomy, rather than in relationship and nurturing. Bolen's analysis is, like all psychological approaches to mythology, necessarily reductive. It takes a goddess who contains multitudes and assigns her a psychological category, which is useful for certain purposes and limiting for others. But the essential observation is correct. Artemis represents something in the human psyche, something particularly, but not exclusively feminine, that is real and important and frequently undervalued. The capacity for self-direction, the ability to know what you want and pursue it without apology. The comfort with solitude that is not loneliness, but fullness. The experience of being alone in a natural landscape and feeling, rather than diminished, enlarged, complete. In the late 20th century, the emerging environmental movement found in Artemis another kind of relevance, not primarily psychological, but ecological. The goddess who had always been the divine principle of the non-human world, the guardian of the boundary between the human and the wild, the protector of wild animals and wild places, suddenly seemed less like an ancient metaphor and more like a practical necessity. The wild world that Artemis had always guarded was under threat in ways that no previous human civilization had achieved. The forests she ran through were being cleared at unprecedented rates. The wild animals she had always protected were disappearing from the earth at a pace that the geological record suggested had not been matched since the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous period 66 million years ago. The goddess of wild places, in this context, became something more urgent than a mythological figure or a psychological archetype. She became a way of thinking about what was at stake, a way of articulating, in the language of myth and the emotional register of sacred relationship, what the loss of the wild world actually meant, not just economically or ecologically in the technical sense of those words, but spiritually, existentially, in terms of what human beings are and what we need at the deepest level in order to remain ourselves. I want to tell you about a moment that I think about often when I think about Artemis and what she means in the world we actually inhabit. In 2019, scientists monitoring the recovery of wolf populations in Europe reported something that they called a trophic cascade, a term that sounds technical but describes something almost mythologically powerful. When wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park in the United States in 1995, after an absence of 70 years, the entire ecosystem of the park began to change. Not just in the obvious ways, the deer population was controlled, the vegetation began to recover, but in ways that no one had predicted. The rivers changed course. Literally, the physical geography of the park shifted because the return of the predator changed the behavior of the prey animals, which changed the grazing patterns, which changed the vegetation on the riverbanks, which changed the soil stability, which changed the way the rivers moved through the landscape. The return of a single predator, a single representative of the wild, non-human world, had changed everything. The rivers moved differently. The land was different. The whole interlocking system of the ecosystem, which had been working with a crucial absence at its center for 70 years, reorganized itself around the returned presence of the wolf with a speed and a completeness that astonished the ecologists watching it happen. This is what Artemis has always known. This is what her entire mythology has always been saying. From the very first stories told about her in the forests of Arcadia, that the wild world is a system and every part of it matters, and the removal of any element, any sacred grove, any apex predator, any wild animal, any boundary between the human and the non-human sends consequences cascading through the whole structure in ways that are far harder to predict than they are to prevent. The trophic cascade is the scientific name for what Artemis has always been the mythological principle of. The profound, irreducible, non-negotiable importance of wildness. The wolves changed the rivers. She always knew they would. And now we come to the end. Not of Artemis. She does not end. But of our particular conversation with her. This one that has been unfolding across 4 long chapters and is now reaching its conclusion in this quiet, final hour. I want to say something honest about why I chose to tell you this story in this particular way. In the darkness, in the slow voice, in the register of something between a bedtime story and a lecture and a meditation. I chose it because I believe that the way we receive information changes what we do with it. The bright, busy, anxious, distracted mode of daytime attention that most of us live in most of the time is very good at acquiring facts and very bad at integrating them, at letting them settle into the deeper layers of the mind where they can do the work that genuine knowledge does, the work of changing how you see things rather than simply adding to the inventory of things you know. Artemis has never been primarily about facts. She has always been about seeing, about the quality of attention you bring to the world around you, particularly the non-human world, particularly the wild places, particularly the edge places where the ordinary ends and something older and less nameable begins. The ancient Greeks who built her first shrines in mountain groves were not making a theological argument. They were recording an experience, the experience of being in a wild place at the right moment with the right quality of attention and feeling, unmistakably, that the place was alive in a way that exceeded any purely physical explanation, that something was present, that you were not alone, I have had this experience. Most people who have spent real time in real wild places have had this experience, though they describe it in different languages and attribute it to different sources depending on their theological inclinations. The experience itself, the sudden, certain, wordless sense of being in the presence of something larger and older and more real than the ordinary texture of daily life, is consistent across cultures and centuries, with a consistency that suggests it is tracking something genuine rather than simply projecting. The ancient Greeks called that something Artemis. You do not have to call it that. You do not have to call it anything. The name is less important than the attention, than the willingness to enter the wild world with genuine humility and genuine receptivity, to acknowledge that it does not exist for your benefit and does not require your participation to be what it is, to feel the particular quality of presence that a forest has when you have walked far enough into it that the sound of the road is completely gone. She is there. She has always been there. The question is whether you are paying attention. Let me tell you what happened to Iphigenia. We left her, in the 3rd chapter, suddenly transported from the altar at Aulis to the distant country of Taurus on the shores of the Black Sea, bewildered and alive, serving as the priestess of Artemis in a place so remote it was practically the edge of the known world. She had been saved from death by the goddess who demanded her sacrifice, which is the kind of divine logic that requires either acceptance or rejection, and does not yield to middle positions. In Euripides' play, Iphigenia in Taurus, written around 414 BCE, one of the most structurally elegant and emotionally satisfying plays in the classical canon, her brother Orestes arrives in Taurus on a mission assigned to him by Apollo. He must steal the sacred statue of Artemis from the temple there and bring it back to Greece. He arrives with his friend Pylades, is immediately captured by the Taurians, and is brought before the priestess, whose job it is to consecrate strangers for sacrifice to the goddess. The scene in which Iphigenia and Orestes recognize each other, after years of separation, after everything they have each separately survived, in a remote barbarian temple at the edge of the world, is one of the great recognition scenes in all of drama. Euripides takes his time with it. The recognition is gradual, interrupted, almost averted several times by misunderstanding and the sheer improbability of the situation. And then it lands, the moment when Iphigenia knows that the man before her is her brother, alive, real, standing in front of her in the temple where she has been serving the goddess who saved her life. They escape together. They take the statue. They go home. Artemis, who arranged all of it, who saved Iphigenia from the altar, who kept her alive in Taurus, who sent her brother to find her, says nothing in the play. She does not appear. She does not explain. She is present only in the architecture of the plot, in the way the events have been arranged to bring two separated people back together in the most unlikely possible place. She works, as she has always worked, through the shape of things rather than through speech, through the trajectory of the arrow rather than the words of the archer. This is, I think, the most honest portrait of divine action in all of Greek mythology, not the god appearing in a blaze of light to announce their intentions, but the shape of events gradually revealing an intention that was always there, but could only be seen in retrospect. Not the burning bush, but the return of the brother. Not the parting of the sea, but the recognition in a far country, the reunion that should have been impossible and wasn't. Artemis does not explain herself. She does not need to. The arrow lands where it was always going to land. The outcome was always the outcome. The only question was whether you were paying enough attention to understand it when it arrived. We are at the end now. I mean this in every sense. At the end of the story, and at the end of the night, and at the end of the particular quality of attention that the darkness has made available to us. Soon the birds will begin. They always begin before the light. A single bird first, tentative, testing, and then another, and then the whole collective decision of the dawn chorus committing to the new day with an enthusiasm that seems, at this hour, slightly aggressive, but is ultimately irresistible. Before they begin, let me give you this. Artemis asked Zeus for 6 things on the day she was born: a silver bow and arrows, eternal virginity, a name that was not the same as her twin brothers, the whole wilderness as her domain, 60 nymphs to run with her, and the title, the role of helper in the time of greatest need. 6 requests from a 3-year-old goddess who had just assisted at the birth of her own twin brother and already understood, with the complete clarity that comes from having just entered the world, exactly what it was going to need from her. The silver bow, precision, the commitment to accuracy, to the arrow that does not miss, to the consequence that is exactly proportionate to the cause. Not cruelty, not mercy. Truth, eternal virginity, sovereignty, the self that belongs to itself, that has not been subsumed into someone else's narrative, that remains after every encounter, every loss, every 3,000-year accumulation of history, identifiably itself, a name of her own, identity. The refusal to be defined by your relationship to someone else, even someone as significant as a twin, even someone who shares your origin and your parentage and your divine nature. You are yourself, not half of something else. Yourself. The wilderness, the whole continuous, irreplaceable non-human world, the forests and the mountains and the rivers and the wild animals and the dark between the stars, all of it in her care, all of it sacred, all of it real. The companions, the understanding that sovereignty is not isolation, that running alone and running with chosen companions through a chosen landscape are not opposites, but complements, that you can be both solitary and accompanied, both independent and in community, both complete in yourself and enriched by others who are equally complete in themselves. And the last one, the most important one, the one that the ancient sources often treat as an afterthought, but which is, I think, the key to everything else, the title of helper, the role of protector, the willingness to be present at the moment when presence matters most, not the glorious moments, not the ceremonial occasions, but the moments of genuine extremity, the birth that goes wrong, the young girl who needs protecting, the refugee at the altar, Iphigenia with the knife above her head. She asked to be useful, a goddess who had just been born, who could have asked for anything, who was sitting on the knee of the most powerful being in the universe and feeling his beard and asking for her heart's desire. She asked, among all the things she asked for, to be the one who helped when help was most needed. This is the thing about Artemis that I hope you carry with you out of this story and into whatever comes next. Not the silver bow, though there is something to be learned from the commitment to precision and the willingness to let the consequence of a violation be real. Not the sovereignty, though there is everything to be learned from the 3-year-old who knew exactly what she needed and asked for it clearly and received it. Not even the wilderness, though the wild world needs every advocate it can find and myth is one of the most powerful forms of advocacy human beings have ever invented. What I hope you carry is the last request, the helper, the protector at the boundary, the one who shows up at the moment of greatest need with no agenda other than to make sure that the young, the vulnerable, the frightened, the unjustly threatened, that they do not face the worst of it alone. This is available to everyone. You do not need a silver bow. You do not need a wilderness or a pack of hunting hounds or a company of nymphs or a divine commission from Zeus. You need only what Artemis has always had: the attention, the precision, the willingness to see clearly and act truly, and the understanding that the boundary between the human world and the darkness beyond it is real and matters and requires someone to stand at it. She has been standing there for 3,000 years. The watch does not have to be kept by one person. It never did. The first bird is beginning. I told you it would. That single tentative note in the darkness, the question that precedes the answer of the full dawn chorus. Outside your window, the sky is doing something subtle and irreversible. The stars are fading, not because they are going anywhere, but because the light is returning. And in the returning light, the stars become invisible, not absent, just overwhelmed by something brighter that is also beautiful. Artemis is still there. She is in the last of the darkness before the dawn, as she has always been in the last of the darkness before the dawn. She is in the single bird's first note. She is in the line of light at the horizon that is not yet gold, but is no longer black. She is in every forest that is still standing, every wolf still moving through the mountains, every wild creature going about its wild business in the wild world that has somehow, improbably, survived everything we have done to it, and is still, this morning, as it was on the first morning, itself. She is watching the boundary. She is keeping the watch. She has always been keeping the watch. You can sleep now. The precinct is secure. The asylum holds. The arrow is true. Tomorrow, or today, in a few hours, when you wake up to the full light and the full noise and the full demanding complexity of your actual life, there will be things that need your attention, things that need your precision and your willingness to be present at the moment when presence matters. There will be boundaries to watch, and vulnerable things to protect, and wild places to notice, and people who need someone to show up at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right quality of attention. She will not do any of it for you. She never did anything for anyone. She worked through people, through events, through the precise trajectory of consequences that she set in motion and then stepped back from, trusting the arrow to fly true. You are the arrow. You have always been the arrow. Now sleep. The huntress is here. The night is almost over. And when it is, when the light comes and the birds are loud and the ordinary world reassembles itself around you with all its weight and all its beauty, go outside. Find a tree that is older than you are. Stand under it for a moment. Be quiet. She will be there. She is always there. Good night.